DevilNeverCry.
Throughout the entirety of Final Fantasy XVI, Clive Rosfield, the protagonist, is capable of wielding multiple elements of power, allowing him to assuredly get to his goal at the end of the game. Set over multiple decades, the power that Clive attains is what allows him to ultimately defy fate and to right the wrongs of his past. But what if Clive only had the power of the Phoenix and the inherent power of Ifrit to carry him towards his goal? Would he prevail? Thus enters what I like to call the Rosfield run. I'm going to be going through pretty much the entirety of Final Fantasy XVI and its key pivotal moments using only the power of the Phoenix. Typically within Final Fantasy XVI, you'd be able to junction up to 3 specific icons, allowing you to wield not only their unique iconic feat, but 2 extra iconic skills as well. By essentially choosing to use just the Phoenix, I've essentially cut down my combat capability to 1/3 of what it normally would be. To add to that, this challenge is going to be played through on the game's arcade mode, which might seem strange at first, but let me explain why this ultimately makes this a more difficult challenge. The first reason we're choosing to do this via arcade mode is to avoid cheesing the game and making it too easy. Whenever you play a stage in arcade mode, the game will actually lock your level to one that is more appropriate to whatever story moment you're currently playing in, meaning that you're not going to be able to grind your way up and out to victory. Coincidentally, arcade mode also locks part of your equipment, specifically your weapon and defensive gear, so that once again, you can't cheese your way through difficult encounters by just bringing in overpowered gear. And the third reason that we're specifically using arcade mode is because once again, it also limits the amount of items that you're able to take in to any specific stage, meaning that if an encounter or section is giving me too much difficulty, I can't just item my way out of it. And with that, I think it's time I stop talking and start playing Final Fantasy XVI. Kicking things off with the first stage, the Greenwood Dungeon, you'll notice that we're playing on Final Fantasy mode. I wasn't quite sure whether I wanted to tackle this all in Final Fantasy mode or on normal, but I'm going to get to the distinction between the two later on in this run. The first thing that I notice immediately, however, is how much this run essentially is a marathon instead of a sprint. What I mean by this is the fact that the game has been balanced meticulously so around having a full suite of abilities and icons. And so when you only have 2 abilities and 1 iconic feat to your advantage, every single fight ends up taking 2 or 3 times the standard amount it would have taken to go through that encounter if you just had a full kit available. Couple that in with the fact that we're playing on Final Fantasy mode, where enemy health has been inflated substantially, and I'm not just talking about mini-bosses and bosses, and a run that ends up being quite challenging and fun in the initial opening hours, ends up feeling quite tedious by the time you hit perhaps the 5th or 6th hour mark. Nevertheless, we end up making quick work of the Greenwood stage before moving on to the second stage, Carenorvent. If, like me, you put well over 15 hours into the demo of Final Fantasy XVI, then this stage should feel quite familiar. You'll notice that I started off this run with Heatwave and Flames of Rebirth as my go-to skills. Heatwave ends up being a mainstay throughout the entirety of this run. It is that useful, it's great as a projectile, it hits multiple enemies, it penetrates through multiple enemies, I know people love that word, and it of course does a good amount of stun damage. On the other hand, Flames of Rebirth, which I started off with, quickly ends up being swapped out for a few other abilities before I believe I ultimately end up settling on Rising Flame, as it does a healthy amount of damage. Speaking of, that balance between standard damage and will or stagger damage is very important. You can't play this run the same way you would playing the game normally. The Phoenix has a decent slew of abilities that do a moderate amount of stun damage, but doesn't really have any heavy hitting attacks that do a lot of physical damage, meaning that whenever enemies were stunned, whenever I broke their stagger bar, I was often left flailing and trying to do as many things as I possibly could to eke out as much damage as possible, lest I be stuck in the encounter for longer than I have to. Benedicta ends up going down quite quickly, thanks to the aforementioned experience I have learning her patterns from the demo and from playing the game overall. We move on to the third stage, Eye of the Storm. We're mainly focusing on this first initial fight when you face off against Garuda simply as Clive, as opposed to when we transformed into Ifrit, as that pretty much stays exactly the same, regardless of however many icons you have junctioned. Overall, I found this boss fight to be somewhat fair. The size of the boss means that she doesn't necessarily hit all too fast, which means that you can see a lot of her attacks coming from a mile away, especially because they are very well telegraphed. Even some of her larger area of effect attacks are somewhat easy to dodge, provided you get your positioning right. But again, I was able to essentially scrape through this fight by simply playing defensively, which is definitely something you're gonna have to get used to by playing through a run like this, as playing too aggressively will end up getting you killed quite quickly. A conversation I'll likely continue on as we move on to the next dungeon, King's Fall. One of my favorite locales throughout this game, in fact, one of my favorite missions or stages throughout this game, simply because of how brisk its pace truly is. But going back to what I said, because we're playing on Final Fantasy mode, we do have to play quite defensively, primarily because it only takes a few attacks from just some of the enemies and you'll end up with a game over screen. There are plenty of mini-bosses and bosses, of course, that have one move that is multi-hitting that will stun-lock you to death if you can't pop an item fast enough to heal you back up. And so attempting this run on this difficulty ultimately left me with a dilemma. The only heavy-hitting moves that I have are my skills, and whenever I use a skill, I am essentially rooted to the ground, in place, unable to move, unable to dodge. And as we know, one of the main factors that they've added in Final Fantasy mode is hyper armor for enemies, which will allow enemies to straight up tank some of your strongest attacks without flinching, allowing them to start an attack animation whilst you're still in the middle of yours. And it's safe to say, considering the amount of damage that enemies do, you definitely don't want to be trading direct blows, as it is a quick way to death. And so also going back to what I said about enemies having a substantial amount of health, meaning that fights are longer and slower, the fact that you have to really pick and choose your moments to use your skills also meant that a lot of encounters were artificially extended in that manner as well. We end up making quick work of King's Fall and the boss at the end, the Knight of the Dying Sun, as his attack patterns are exactly the same as the Knight of the Blinding Dawn that you were able to play against in the demo. That then brings us on to the 5th dungeon, Phoenix Gate, which is as long as it is hard, or arduous is perhaps a better term there. This dungeon wasn't necessarily super difficult, though it does highlight something that Final Fantasy mode does, which of course is replacing enemies with later variants of them to essentially make things harder. As an example, you'll end up seeing an Akashic Warlord here, who you wouldn't necessarily see, I believe, until you're almost on your way to the Ash continent in the main game. Whilst we're here, I'll quickly go over what accessories I ended up using for this run. The first of which were the Genji gloves, which gave you a flat percentage boost to your overall attack damage. Again, anything to help me eke out as much damage as possible. I ended up using the Badges of Might, or Metal I believe, which give you just a standard numeric boost to your overall attack damage. And the last accessory that I ended up using was one that helped speed up the recovery time for Heatwave, allowing me to use it in more rapid succession. With Phoenix Gate bested, it was time to move on to Sandberg. It was at this point that I felt a little bit of fatigue with this run, and thus I ended up playing much more sloppily. And it ultimately cost me, as this is where we encountered our first game over in this run. The Imperial Cannoneer went absolutely Akashic and stoved my head in with his great big cannon. Thankfully, the checkpoints in arcade mode weren't too bad, so I picked myself up, dusted myself off, and moved on. Things continued to progress smoothly until I had to face both the Lich and the Undertaker at the same time. The main issue was the fact that one would continue to do all of their attack animations regardless of whether or not they were on screen. What a lot of difficult action or character action games do quite well is they'll only let enemies start attack animations whenever they're on screen, allowing you to divide and conquer enemies and difficult enemy encounters provided you were able to manipulate the camera correctly. After scraping by that encounter, I ended up facing off against the Akashic Dragon, who I ended up getting to pretty much almost no health before they ended up one-shotting me because I mistimed a dodge. After gritting my teeth and trying not to think about the 6 minutes that I wasted, I tried again and prevailed, before facing off against some of Typhon's revenants and ultimately moving on to the boss fight between Ifrit and Typhon. That brings us on to stage 7. COS Nice, where the cost of goods is rather nice, I'd like to imagine, but Perhaps not, especially when Sid or Clive is here at this part of the story and things have taken a turn for the worst. Coming off of what felt like an eternity in Sandberg, COS Nice was a nice change of pace. I ended up switching out Rising Flames for Ignition, which at the time I thought was somewhat decent, but I ultimately fell back to using Rising Flame shortly after, as Ignition just didn't quite cut it. That brings us on to the 8th dungeon, Drake's Breath, where I attempted to do what I normally attempt to do in challenge runs, and that is skirt by any encounter I possibly could skip. Unfortunately, with the way that encounters are essentially gated here, I wasn't able to prevail or move on from any area unless I cleared out all of the enemies surrounding where I was. Even if the exit to an area was like half a mile up the road, it literally wouldn't let you go through unless you defeated all of the enemies in that particular area. Alas, having my plans thwarted once more, I conceded defeat and continued to just wipe out all of the enemies I could get my hands on, including the Akashic Morble, who did pretty much nothing but sit there and take an absolute pounding, probably against TOS that, before moving on to Budget Fafnir, the Flame Lizard, who unsurprisingly put up more of a fight than Fafnir, but ultimately succumbed to the same fate. That swiftly brings us on to dungeon number 9, Rosalith, where we're tasked with going to our old stomping grounds and facing off against Giga Simp Hugo. Some of you keen-eyed viewers will have noticed that this is when I swapped from Final Fantasy mode back to standard mode to see what the disparity between them was, and quite honestly, fights were much more straightforward and funner to tackle on this mode, specifically because attacking enemies doesn't feel like you're attempting to take a brick wall down with nothing but a toothpick. That said, however, you could still feel the empty void left behind by the lacking icons and their abilities. Needless to say, the mini-bosses, the Curl and the Stone Headmans, went down like absolute chumps, and even Hugo himself didn't prove to be much of a challenge. Moving on to dungeon number 10, Drake's Fang. At this point, I've thoroughly switched back to Rising Flame, locking me in for the remainder of this run. I don't believe I changed my skills at all from now until the end. Continuing to make our way through the underground mines, nothing really gives us all too much trouble. Not even the mini-boss who was absolutely obsessed with the spirits within could stand in our way. Cutting through the underground palace with its gleaming floors and decadent architecture, we eventually find ourselves face to face with Hugo, who quite literally can't get a grip, and thus we end the dungeon as we face off in our Ifrit form. That brings us onto the Crystalline Dominion, where we get a round 2 against Sandberg and their Imperial army. This has to be the longest dungeon in the game. It doesn't really feel like it playing through the main story, particularly when you're engaged and engrossed with the story for the first time, and you're watching all of these cutscenes wondering what would happen next. But when you ultimately cut it down to just its combat encounters, with a combat system that has been pretty much lobotomized thanks to some self-imposed restrictions, and it just never ends. Facing off against the White Dragon marks the midway point, before culminating in a fight against the Necrophobe right at the very end. Though the standard combat encounters didn't give me all too much trouble, the bosses were the ones to look out for, as they still had attacks that would deal hefty damage, somewhat comparable to Final Fantasy mode. Thankfully, this dungeon ends with a wonderful palate cleanser, being Ifrit and Phoenix versus Bahamut. Pressing ahead, we come to dungeon number 12, Canva, and once again, I actually really like this dungeon, particularly because of how brisk the pace is. And of course, it doesn't hurt that it ends in one of the coolest bosses, in my opinion, in this game. Though it does seem quite weird, utterly battering some poor horse, but needless to say, we don't show any mercy. Dungeon 13, the Ironworks, isn't all that much of a dungeon. Instead, it's a large-scale skirmish in which you have to hold out and not even defeat all of the enemies that surround you. The beauty of moves like Heatwave truly shine in encounters such as this, as they're able to hit multiple enemies at once, provided that they're standing anywhere in the vicinity of each other. You do technically have party members helping you out, such as Lord Byron and Joshua, but if there's one thing that I've realized in this run, is that your companions or your party, so to speak, barely do any damage whatsoever, other than perhaps Torgal, who seems to do some sort of tangible damage that is actually visible on an enemy's health bar. There have been times, however, that I've seen Jill attack an enemy with a blizzard-based attack, and it does almost no damage. The horse comes back for a round 2 and gets his cheeks thoroughly clapped, and that brings us onto the 14th dungeon, the Naldia Narrow. The sky is dark, grey and gloomy. Just like the UK, it was almost as if I took a step outside. With all the black powder and cannonballs just laying around, I'm surprised that Clive's powers of fire didn't implode the ship completely. Nevertheless, a few close calls later, and all of a sudden we find ourselves on the sea floor, facing off against Odin. Of course, this is supposed to be a scripted loss, however, you do actually have to whittle his health down to the point where he begins to gather darkness, almost as if he's tapped into Kingdom Hearts lore. After getting hit harder than post-nut clarity, we move on to dungeon number 15, Reverie. In this dungeon, a man is forced to climb an arduous and tumultuous tower, facing off against the man who is but the spitting image of him atop it in the pale moonlight as the rain sings across the ground, an exclamation point to everything that has come thus far. Drunk in their own ideals, they cast off their pride and embrace their fate, souls screaming as they go, with justice dwelling within the soul victor. If you thought I was describing DevilNeverCry 3, you'd be correct. If you thought I was describing Final Fantasy XVI, you'd also be correct. Climbing up the tower wasn't all too difficult. In fact, the true challenge, of course, lied with the multi-stage Odin boss fight. Playing through this again, I'm reminded of how many unskippable cutscenes there are in this game. Nevertheless, facing off against Odin once more was quite fun, even if I did have to expend the use of a lot of items because I played so sloppily. Something that did catch my attention, however, was the fact that when Odin began to gather darkness, I almost failed to stop the attack coming out entirely. Though my health was 3/4 of the way full, I suspect that if he got this attack out, I would have died immediately. Considering how close he got here, I wonder if I'd even be able to stop it on Final Fantasy mode. Soaring ahead, we come to the penultimate dungeon, Drake's Spine. Knowing that I was getting closer to the end of the run and that I'd finally have my sanity back soon, I felt quite jovial going into this dungeon, and, quite honestly, it didn't pose much of an issue. We had the behemoth to take care of quite quickly, which didn't go too bad overall. We had an Akashic Curl who attempted to stop us, which didn't go so well for the curl, and then we finally had wave after wave after wave of enemies near the end. Again, didn't pose all too much of a threat. We do have Ultima to contend with here at the end, which unfortunately I did get another game over screen, primarily because I was too aggressive in how I played, but ultimately we were able to prevail once I reloaded the checkpoint. With the controller heavy in my hand, I pressed on to the final dungeon, Origin. This is a 3-phase fight against the final boss, chock full of unskippable sequences and cutscenes. The first of which has you facing off against Ultima, who ends up going down quite quickly, though at times I did feel like a chump in some sort of Final Fantasy antagonist combo mad, as I ended up getting clipped with several attacks that I thought that I had dodged. After draining his long health bar, Ultima gets all bricked up, on a Thursday night no less, and becomes Ultima Risen. Once more, the cheeks are clapped. This time we do it in some sort of space-time continuum, before we come crashing back down to the world, where we face off against the final boss in his final phase, Ultimalius. Going for gold once more, and because I quite honestly didn't want to see another game over or restart checkpoint screen, I expended every single item the game afforded me, and we end up absolutely decimating Ultimalius, even if Clive, for whatever reason in the cutscenes, starts using all of these icons that I didn't have access to at all. Clive asks Ultimalius if he wants to know how to do an infinite, and then proceeds to hit him with a light punch for 999,999, and thus we finally come to the end of our run with the question finally answered: can you beat Final Fantasy XVI using only the power of the Phoenix? Could Clive have truly grasped victory tightly within the palm of his hand, relying solely on the power of the Ross Fields? Yes, absolutely yes. Do I recommend you play the game and its combat this way, particularly on difficulties like Final Fantasy mode? No. No. Unless you're some sort of a sadist or perhaps a masochist, and you like to see pain, don't do it. I've done it for you. If you enjoyed today's video, leave a like and subscribe, as it helps out a ton with the algorithm. If you're into Final Fantasy, definitely check out some of my previous videos on Final Fantasy XVI, as you may find some of them helpful. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.